3 times a day. What the rancher did next altered history. Wild West stories. The sun was just beginning to rise over the wide lands of the Wild West. The sky was painted with soft shades of orange and pink, and the cool morning wind moved gently across the open fields. Far away from the busy towns and dusty streets, there was a quiet ranch sitting near a long valley. This ranch belonged to a man named Elias Carter. Elias was not a famous man. He was not a sheriff, a gambler, or a gunfighter like the men people talked about in saloons. He was simply a rancher who worked hard every day and lived a peaceful life with his cattle and his horse. People in the nearby town of Red Creek knew him, but they did not know him very well. Elias did not talk much. When he came to town, he bought what he needed, nodded politely to people, and then returned to his ranch before sunset. Still, there was something about Elias Carter that made people curious. Every single day, without fail, Elias followed the same strange routine. 3 times a day, he rode his horse to the same hill that stood at the edge of his land, first in the morning, then again in the afternoon, and once more during the sunset. No one knew why. The hill was not very large, but it stood high enough to overlook the entire valley. From the top, a person could see miles of dry land, scattered trees, and a thin river that slowly moved through the fields. For years, the valley had struggled. The soil was dry, strong winds often crossed the plains, and many farms had failed. Some families had even packed their wagons and left the area, searching for better land somewhere else. But Elias Carter stayed, and every day, 3 times a day, he rode to that hill. One morning in Red Creek, a group of men sat outside the small general store. They were drinking coffee and watching the road that led out of town. One of them, a tall rancher named Bill Dawson, shook his head. "There goes Elias again," he said. In the distance, they could see a single rider moving slowly across the land. It was Elias, riding his old brown horse toward the hill. Another man laughed. "That man must be looking for buried treasure," he said. A third man leaned back in his chair. "Treasure? On that dry hill," he said. "If there was treasure there, someone would have found it years ago." They all watched the small figure ride toward the hill. Bill Dawson narrowed his eyes. "He's been doing that for years," he said. "Morning, afternoon, sunset, always the same hill." "But what does he do there?" someone asked. No one had an answer. The truth was simple. No one had ever followed him. Later that same day, a young traveler arrived in Red Creek. His name was Samuel Reed, and he looked no older than 16. Dust covered his boots, and a small bag hung from his shoulder. Samuel had been traveling for weeks, moving from town to town, doing small jobs to earn food and a place to sleep. As he walked through town, he noticed a group of men still talking outside the store. 3 times a day, one of them was saying. Samuel stopped nearby and listened. "Who rides 3 times a day?" Samuel asked politely. The men looked at him. Bill Dawson pointed toward the distant hill. "That rancher out there," he said. "Elias Carter." Samuel looked across the valley. In the far distance, he could see the small hill standing alone in the wide land. "What does he do there?" Samuel asked. Bill Dawson shrugged. "That's the question everyone asks," he replied. "But no one knows." Another man chuckled. "Maybe he talks to ghosts," he joked. The men laughed, but Samuel kept looking toward the hill. Something about the story caught his attention. A man riding to the same place 3 times every single day for years. That did not sound like a joke to Samuel. It sounded like a mystery. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Samuel quietly walked out of town. The air was cool and the land was silent. In the distance, he saw a familiar figure riding slowly across the valley. Elias Carter. The rancher was heading toward the hill once again. Samuel kept his distance as he followed. The hill grew closer as the sun slowly climbed into the sky. Birds flew across the open land, and the wind moved through the dry grass. Finally, Elias reached the top of the hill. Samuel carefully stopped behind a group of rocks at the base, watching from far away. From where he stood, he could see Elias dismount from his horse. The rancher walked slowly across the hill, carrying a small wooden box in his hands. Samuel leaned forward, trying to see what he was doing. Elias opened the box. Then he did something that made Samuel even more curious. The rancher knelt down, pressed something into the ground, and placed a small wooden marker beside it. Samuel looked closer. To his surprise, the hill was already filled with many small wooden markers. Row after row, line after line, dozens of them, maybe even hundreds. Samuel's eyes widened. "What is he doing?" he whispered to himself. The quiet rancher stood up, looked across the valley, and gently brushed the dust from his hands. Then Elias Carter returned his horse and began riding back toward his ranch. Samuel remained hidden behind the rocks, staring at the strange hill covered with wooden markers. He had followed the rancher to discover a simple answer. Instead, he had found a much bigger mystery, and Samuel had a strong feeling that whatever Elias Carter was doing on that hill was only the beginning of something important. The next afternoon, the sun was bright above the valley, and the warm wind moved slowly across the open land. Samuel Reed had spent the whole morning thinking about what he had seen on the hill. Those wooden markers were still in his mind, row after row, line after line. He had never seen anything like it before. Samuel sat near a small fence outside Red Creek, watching the road that led toward Elias Carter's ranch. He knew the rancher would ride to the hill again. The townspeople had said it clearly, 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, sunset. Samuel decided he would follow him again, not because he wanted to cause trouble, but because he truly wanted to understand the mystery of the hill. Soon enough, he saw a familiar rider in the distance. Elias Carter was leaving his ranch once again. The rancher rode slowly, just as he had in the morning. His old brown horse moved calmly across the dry land, as if it already knew the path by heart. Samuel stood up quietly and began walking behind him from far away. The land stretched wide and open. Small bushes and dry grass covered the ground, and the wind carried the smell of dust through the valley. After some time, Elias reached the hill again. Samuel hid behind the same group of rocks where he had watched earlier that morning. From there, he could clearly see the rancher. Elias climbed down from his horse and lifted the same small wooden box. The rancher walked to one of the empty spaces between the markers. Then he knelt down. Samuel watched carefully. This time he paid closer attention. Elias opened the box and took out a small handful of something. From a distance, it looked like tiny brown grains. The rancher pressed the grains into the soil, covered them gently with dirt, and then placed another wooden marker beside the spot. Samuel slowly realized what he was looking at. Those grains were seeds. Elias Carter was planting seeds on the hill. But that raised another question in Samuel's mind. Why would someone plant seeds on such dry land? The soil looked weak and dusty. The wind was strong in the valley, and rain was rare. Still, Elias planted the seeds carefully, as if he believed something important would grow there. After placing the marker, Elias stood up and looked across the valley. He stayed still for a moment, watching the land below. Samuel noticed something else. Some of the older markers had tiny green plants growing beside them, very small, but alive. Samuel's eyes widened. The seeds were growing. Not all of them, but some had survived, and that meant Elias had been planting seeds for a long time, much longer than Samuel had imagined. The rancher closed the wooden box and began walking back toward his horse. This time, Samuel decided to do something brave. Instead of hiding, he slowly stepped out from behind the rocks. "Excuse me, sir," Samuel called. Elias Carter stopped. The rancher turned and looked toward the boy. His face showed surprise, but not anger. Samuel walked up the hill slowly. "I hope I didn't scare you," Samuel said politely. Elias studied the young traveler for a moment. "You've been watching," the rancher said calmly. Samuel nodded. "Yes, sir." The old rancher did not seem upset. Instead, he gave a small smile. "That hill makes people curious," Elias said. Samuel looked around at the rows of markers. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Grass and trees," Elias replied. Samuel looked confused. "Out here?" he asked. Elias nodded. "For many years this valley has been losing its soil," the rancher explained. "Strong winds carry the dirt away. Without plants and roots, the land slowly dies." Samuel looked across the valley again. The rancher's words suddenly made sense. The dry land, the empty fields, the farms that had failed. But how will this help? Samuel asked. Elias gently touched one of the tiny green plants beside a marker. Roots hold the soil, he said. Grass protects the ground. Trees block the wind. Samuel looked at the long rows of markers again. You planted all of these? He asked. Not all in one day. Elias said with a small laugh, one seed at a time. Samuel slowly understood. That's why you come here 3 times a day, he said. Elias nodded. If I plant a little every day, the rancher explained, the hill will slowly change. And when the hill changes, the valley will follow. Samuel looked around once more. The small plants were proof that the rancher's work was already beginning to succeed. Still, the task seemed enormous. There are hundreds of empty spaces left, Samuel said. Elias closed the wooden box. Yes, he said. Then he looked toward the horizon. And tomorrow I'll plant a few more. Samuel felt something change inside him as he listened to the rancher. Most people in town thought Elias Carter was strange. But standing on that hill, surrounded by tiny green plants fighting to grow in the dry soil, Samuel realized something important. The quiet rancher was not wasting his time. He was slowly changing the land, seed by seed, marker by marker, day after day. And somehow, Samuel felt that this simple work on the hill. Weeks passed in the quiet valley of Red Creek. The days were warm, the nights were cool, and the wind still moved across the open land. But something small had begun to change on the lonely hill. Samuel Reed visited the hill almost every day now. After meeting Elias Carter, the mystery had slowly turned into something else. Admiration. The young traveler had never seen someone work with such patience. Every morning, afternoon, and sunset, Elias rode to the hill with the same wooden box of seeds. And now, Samuel often helped him. That afternoon, the sun stood high above the valley as Samuel climbed the hill with a small water bag in his hand. Elias was already there, kneeling near one of the rows. The rancher carefully pressed seeds into the ground, while Samuel poured a little water over the soil. Not too much, Elias reminded gently. Samuel nodded. I know, he said with a smile. Around them, the hill no longer looked empty. Many of the older markers now had small patches of green grass growing beside them. Some of the tiny trees had grown tall enough to move slightly with the wind. They were still small, but they were strong. Samuel wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked across the valley. You were right, he said. The plants are growing faster than I thought. Elias stood up slowly and looked at the rows. They only needed a chance, he replied. Samuel looked down at the hill again. Do people in town know what you're doing? He asked. Elias gave a small shrug. Some know, he said. Most don't care. Samuel remembered the men outside the store laughing about the strange rancher who rode to the hill every day. If they saw this, they wouldn't laugh anymore, Samuel said. Elias smiled quietly but said nothing. As the weeks continued, the hill became greener. The grass slowly spread across the soil, holding the dirt in place. The young trees began to grow stronger roots. Even the wind felt slightly calmer on the hillside. One morning, something new happened. As Samuel climbed the hill, he noticed 2 riders approaching from a valley. They were ranchers from nearby land. One of them was Bill Dawson, the tall rancher who had once joked about Elias in front of the store. The men stopped their horses near the hill and looked around. Bill Dawson frowned in surprise. Well, I'll be, he said quietly. The hill looked very different from what he remembered. Rows of green plants now covered much of the ground. Small trees stood in lines where there had once been dry soil. Elias walked toward them calmly. Morning, he greeted. Bill Dawson climbed down from his horse and slowly walked across the hill, looking at the plants. You did all this? He asked. Not alone, Elias replied, nodding toward Samuel. Samuel gave a small wave. Bill Dawson knelt beside one of the young trees. These are growing well, he said. The roots are strong, Elias explained. They hold the soil when the wind comes. The second rancher looked across the valley. My grazing land has been better this season, he said thoughtfully. I thought it was just luck. Elias shook his head gently. The wind has been weaker, he said. The plants slowed down. Bill Dawson stood up and crossed his arms. "You've been working on this hill for years," he said. Elias nodded. "Yes." The rancher looked at the many empty spaces still waiting for seeds. "That's a lot of work for one man." Elias opened the wooden box and held it in his hands. "One seed at a time," he said. Bill Dawson looked around again. The hill was already changing the land around it. Grass had begun to grow stronger near the bottom of the slope. The soil looked darker and healthier. For a long moment, the rancher said nothing. Then he turned to Elias. "Got any extra seeds in that box?" he asked. Samuel smiled. Elias handed him a small handful. Bill Dawson knelt down beside one of the empty spots and pressed the seeds into the soil. The second rancher did the same. That evening, something special happened on the hill. For the first time, more than 2 people were planting seeds. In the following days, other ranchers began to visit. Some came out of curiosity. Some came because their land had improved slightly and they wanted to know why. But many of them stayed to help. Little by little, the work on the hill grew larger. Rows of seeds turned into rows of grass. Small trees turned into lines of green stretching across the hillside, and the valley slowly began to change. The wind was calmer. The soil stayed in place. Even the small river flowing through the valley seemed stronger than before. Samuel stood at the top of the hill one evening during sunset. Beside him, Elias Carter watched the land quietly. Down the hill, several ranchers were planting seeds together. Samuel smiled. "What started with one man," he said softly, "is turning into something much bigger." Elias looked across the valley as the sun slowly disappeared behind the horizon. "Yes," he said calmly. Years passed in the valley of Red Creek, and the land slowly became a place that looked very different from before. Long ago, the valley had been dry and dusty. Strong winds often carried the soil away, and many farmers had struggled to grow crops. Some families had even left their homes, believing the land could no longer support them. But the quiet hill at the edge of the valley had changed everything. What once held only dry soil and scattered rocks was now covered with green grass and growing trees. The wooden markers that Elias Carter had placed one by one were now surrounded by strong plants with deep roots. The hill had become a symbol of patience and hard work, and it all started with one simple habit: 3 times a day. Even after many years, Elias Carter still rode to the hill every morning, afternoon, and sunset. His horse was older now, and Elias himself walked more slowly than he used to. But the routine never changed. Samuel Reed, who had once been a curious traveler, had now become a young rancher himself. He worked alongside Elias and helped take care of the growing land. One cool morning, Samuel stood on the hill and looked across the valley. He could see fields of healthy grass where there had once been empty land. Ranchers moved their cattle across wide green pastures. Farmers worked in fields that now held strong soil. Even the small river that crossed the valley flowed more steadily. Samuel smiled. The valley felt alive again. Footsteps behind him made him turn around. It was Elias Carter, slowly walking up the hill with his wooden box. The box looked old now. The corners were worn from years of use, but it still held seeds just like it always had. Samuel walked toward him. "You should rest today," Samuel said kindly. "You've done more than enough of this valley." Elias gave a gentle smile. "The land still needs care," he replied. Samuel looked across the hill again. The trees were taller now, their branches moving softly with the wind. "Look at this place," Samuel said. "You changed everything." Elias followed Samuel's gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Elias shook his head slightly. "I only planted seeds," he said. Samuel laughed softly. "You did much more than that." Down the hill, several ranchers were already working together. Some were planting new rows of trees, while others repaired small fences that protected the plants from cattle. Over the years, more and more people had joined the work. The hill had become a meeting place for the valley. Families came to help plant seeds. Children carried small buckets of water, and ranchers worked together to protect the growing trees. What once looked like a strange habit had turned into a shared mission. One afternoon, a group of travelers stopped in Red Creek. They had heard stories about the valley and wanted to see it for themselves. The travelers were surprised by what they saw. Green fields stretched across the land. Tall grass moved in the wind, and the valley looked peaceful and strong. One traveler asked an old shopkeeper in town, "How did this land recover so well?" The shopkeeper smiled and pointed toward the hill in the distance. "It started with a rancher," he said. "A rancher?" the traveler asked. "Yes," the shopkeeper replied. "A quiet man who rode to that hill 3 times a day." Later that evening, the travelers climbed the hill to see it themselves. They found Elias Carter and Samuel standing beside a row of young trees. The travelers looked around in amazement. "It's beautiful here," one of them said. Samuel nodded. "It wasn't always like this." The traveler looked at the rows of trees and the wide green valley below. "So how did it change?" Samuel glanced at Elias and smiled. "One seed at a time," he answered. As the sun slowly set behind the hills, the valley glowed with warm golden light. The trees cast long shadows across the grass, and the air felt calm and peaceful. Elias Carter stood quietly, watching the land he cared for all those years. He did not see himself as someone who changed history. To him, it had always been simple. Plant a seed, protect the soil, return tomorrow and plant another. But the people of Red Creek knew the truth. Because of one rancher's patience, the valley had become a place of life again. And long after Elias Carter was gone, the hill remained covered in green trees and strong grass. People still visited the hill to plant new seeds. They still followed the same routine. Morning, afternoon, sunset, 3 times a day. Not because they had to,